Hello, my name is Dr. Kurt Sander, and this is Music Theory Simplified. You know, when I first started studying music theory in college, I remember that I could do a lot of the things that were expected of a music major. I could write major chords, I knew my seventh chords, I knew my intervals, my key signatures. But one of the things that always frustrated me as a student was that I didn't really understand the concept of harmonic grammar. Now, the textbook that we used wasn't a bad textbook. It talked certainly about how chords are put together, but when it came to talking about the logic of bringing these chords together in a musical phrase, it didn't really help a whole lot. So today's lesson is all about harmonic grammar, and we've come a long way since the days that I took theory in college. We now have a clearer understanding of how to present this information. Now, if you've taken English, you know that grammar deals with categories of words, whether they're verbs, whether they're nouns, adjectives, and so forth. And they teach you how to put those words together. Music is no different. There are certain categories of chords that we find in tonal music, and there's certain progressions and certain rules that we have for bringing those chords together. So let's get started. The secret to knowing the underlying grammar of tonal progression is to remember TSDT, 4 simple letters. T stands for tonic, S for subdominant, and D for dominant. The chord in the T category is simply the one chord. That's our home tonic. The dominant category is almost always represented by the 5 chord, which we actually call the dominant. The subdominant category includes the 2 and the 4, and occasionally the 6. For now, we'll hold off on dealing with the 3 and the 7 chord. So here's the basic rule. Progressions in tonal music will always move from left to right, never from right to left. Let me explain what I mean. In tonal music, tonic chords can move to subdominant chords. Subdominant chords often move to dominant chords, and dominant chords move back to tonic chords. And then the cycle repeats. A very basic musical progression shows this TSDT sequence in action with the 1, 4, 5, 1 chords. But it's also not uncommon to jump over certain chord categories, like a tonic going directly to the dominant and back to the tonic, and repeating the cycle, or to skip over the dominant and go directly from tonic to subdominant to tonic, and repeating the cycle. What we don't find in tonal music, however, are backwards progressions, where dominant chords go to subdominant chords. Before we go on and look at actual music, I want to talk just a moment about the relationship between the tonic and dominant chords in Western tonal music. You see, it's this relationship that we see in the scale that is one of imbalance, meaning that when tonic goes to dominant, there is the sense that something needs to be resolved along the way. Something that maybe comes as a consequence of where the roots are in the scale. If we look at a major or minor scale, we can see that the 5th scale degree is past the halfway point. We have a perfect 5th on the left and a perfect 4th on the right. So there's a feeling of lopsidedness, almost as if it's a teeter-totter with the tonic on one end and the dominant on the other. As tonal music progresses, these harmonic relationships toggle back and forth between tonic and dominant, almost like a pendulum. The first work I want to look at today is a composition by the composer Beethoven. It's a very short piano work titled Für Elise, a well-known piece. And I think this work, more than any other that I've seen, demonstrates perfectly the analogy of that teeter-totter, the idea that tonic and dominant fluctuate back and forth in this kind of pendulum. And I think you'll hear what I mean with this piece. Let's take a listen. I think that was pretty clear to hear that balance of tonic and dominant in that excerpt. And what's interesting is that everything that you just heard was only tonic and dominant. And yet Beethoven was able to sustain the musical interest primarily because of that relationship between tonic and dominant. I'd like to take a look at another piece that does a similar kind of thing, but takes it one step further. Here's a piece that uses the fluctuation between tonic and dominant to convey an underlying narrative.
Perhaps one of the greatest arias of all time was written by operatic composer Giuseppe Verdi. The tenor aria La donna è mobile, or A Woman is Fickle, comes from the 1850 opera Rigoletto. In the third act, the Duke of Mantua sings an aria about what he believes is the unpredictable nature of women.
Now, what I want you to listen for is this underlying dichotomy between tonic and dominant, which we can see in the lyrics of this aria. Even at one point, the orchestra stops on the dominant, and it sets up this kind of tension that we feel throughout this aria.
La donna immobile, qual fiume al vento, muta d'accento e di pensiero.
So I think this gives you a good perspective on how tonic and dominant share a relationship together, and that relationship sustains and energizes a musical passage. But what about those chords that we say belong to the subdominant category?
Well, no birthday would be complete without the singing of the traditional Happy Birthday song. Now, this song is primarily tonic and dominant, with one very notable exception right before the end, when the composer introduces a subdominant chord, the 4 chord. And there's usually a fermata on this chord, and it has the effect of leading. In other words, when we think about the TSDT progression, it's this S that leads us from the tonic to the dominant. And I think you can hear this.
Now you're saying to yourself, yeah, I heard that. It does have the impact of leading us from the tonic to the dominant. And that's really the point of the subdominant in these kinds of contexts, is that they tend to move us. It's almost like that teeter-totter is in the middle when that subdominant appears. But these are all very easy compositions. The piece that I played, the Verdi piece, and the Beethoven, they're using a very simple, almost overly simple harmonic palette. What about more advanced compositions that use more difficult harmonic languages? Well, I will show you how composers can still follow this TSDT model, but by using 7th chords, that's 4-note chords rather than 3-note triads, and using inversions. An inversion is when the root is not the lowest note. A composer can create a much different, more subtle, richer harmonic palette and still follow this TSDT model. So the next piece I want to play for you is by the Russian composer Dmitri Bortnyansky, and it's a choral work that we call a cherubic hymn. And I'm going to play just the opening excerpt for you, and I want you to listen for how the composer uses inversions. And you don't hear that kind of block-style tonic dominant that we heard in the Beethoven and the Verdi and in the Happy Birthday song as well. What an incredibly beautiful work that is, and very different from the first three pieces. So we looked at music that, like the Beethoven and like the Verdi, went right from T to the dominant D and back to the T with no subdominant. And then with the Happy Birthday and this Bortniansky piece, we looked at progressions that went T, S, D, T. But I wanted to show you an example of a progression that skips the dominant altogether. And in the first part of the phrase goes T, S, back to T. And then in the second part of the phrase progresses to the dominant. And I think this is a good example of how composers can stretch out the tension or the prolong the sense of a musical idea by skipping over the dominant in the first part of a phrase.
Here we have the opening of a famous movement from Handel's The Messiah. This is Since by Man Came Death. And you can see if we were to do a harmonic analysis of this, the harmony toward the end gets quite complicated. But what I really want you to focus in on is the first part of this phrase where we get that TST progression without the dominant, without the D, and how that has a softer feeling, prolongational kind of feeling to it. And then, of course, leading up to the dominant at the end, I want you to notice how strong the sense of arrival is on that 5 chord. So many composers have exploited the unresolved dominant chord as a way of sustaining tension because one really wants to hear something that follows that D. So here's the opening of this movement.
Well, we've come down to the end of our lesson, but I hope the things that we talked about today and the compositions that we played give you a better understanding of chord progression and harmonic grammar. Now, this is a very simplistic way of dealing with a very complicated issue, and certainly there are many progressions out there that resist this kind of categorization. But it does seem to make sense for a large portion of tonal music progressions. So that's all the time we have for today's lesson. This is Dr. Sander with Music Theory Simplified, and as always, I'm recommending that you keep it simple.